seems like. He says I actually got him on that one.
What's the trivia answer?
That is Streets of Rage 2, which
Ah,
I only got to play occasionally because it was for Genesis, and we had a Super Nintendo. And you know what I always bugged me about parents was they didn't understand why you needed every console. They just didn't get it, and why having one was good, but why I was annoyed I couldn't play certain Sega um, like side scroller beat 'em up games like Streets of Rage. So I got to play it every now and then.
but I think most of us committed to just one, and
It,
then we just, you
I
know,
I feel like
biasly promoted that one and put down the other.
well, yeah, for that generation, but I feel like with PlayStation, the like N64 and PlayStation was fairly common,
Okay, that's common.
and then after
But
that,
that's because the Nintendo console is so unique that it's not like PlayStation slash Xbox.
yeah,
I don't think very many people have PlayStation and Xbox.
well, not anymore, but there was a time when I think that they did, but now it's all so shitty that who cares? Um, like I can only think of like two unique titles to each of those, and they're both racing games. Xbox has Forza, and PlayStation has Gran Turismo. And PlayStation has no, they all have the new Final Fantasy, don't they? Final Fantasy VII remake, reboot. Anyway, I only play
Yeah.
on the computer. I only play my autistic paradox games on the computer. So anyway,
I don't know which games those are.
those are they're lovingly called spreadsheet games with a map. So they're like intense, grand, global strategy games. So anyway, welcome to
Anyway, go to the first slide.
yeah how do I do this? How do I preview this? Well, I just wanted to show what I came up with because I liked all of these. So can you see yet? No, wait. How
I'm waiting.
you're how do I not usually
Ah, there we go. Yeah.
is it a little it's a little okay, give me 1 second. Let's fix that.
Yeah, we see it now.
Yeah, but it's a little chopped off the top.
Yeah, yeah.
I want to bring that down.
Yeah, fill us in on your process because these thumbnails are getting out of control.
My process is just uh, Hobbit and Asian man do thing. Uh, so, um, yeah.
What are you using? You're using Midjourney or
I'm using Dolly.
Stable Diffusion? Oh, using Dolly. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Let's see. No. I think that should be good. Let's have a look and see what it's like.
Yep.
My preview's not great on here. That should be better.
Oh, I've ambitiously titled to managerial schemes. I'm not entirely sure this is where you're going, but I'm hoping that
Well,
you're gonna link the two
yeah,
together.
it's a feedback. There's a feedback cycle. The the managerialism allows a facilitates a development of nuclear weapons that's happening. Is it too zoomed out now? Looks like it's too zoomed out.
Fine, it's fine. We can see it.
Yeah, but I don't know what I still don't really understand how to do this well. There's a knowledge about nuclear energy that's happening in the late 19th century, and you'll have to pardon me, Jessica, because I am delivering Quigley's thing. I'm not saying that there's such a thing as nuclear energy. I'm only saying what Quigley says. So you'll have to forgive me for parroting the establishment line about nuclear energy. There's this knowledge of nuclear energy that's going around, and I believe Marie Curie dies of nuclear radiation poisoning or something in the late 1800s. They know that there's this thing. They know there's something going on. The early 1800s or the early 1900s is the sort of development of the sort of scientific theory around this, and they are aware more or less that that there's this immense potential with nuclear weapons, and that something can be done with it. But in the beginning, the initial use of development of nuclear weapons show that you need a lot of energy, literal electrical grid power, infrastructure, to develop enough material to do anything with. So all the theory in the world is great, but they needed energy, they needed support and resources, and a number of, particularly the British, Churchill is very much like, we're going to try anything. We're going to try whatever we can. We're going to throw whatever we can into this war because it's all or nothing. And the British are much better at developing what we would call wonder weapons than the Germans. The Germans have lots of wonder weapons on the table, but they never stick with it. They're always... I talked before about the inefficiency of the resource allocation in the Third Reich. Well, today is about resource allocation, basically, and the science of resource allocation. And first off, the Germans Hitler was too ambitious. He was too into wonder weapons that were not worth their return in a small enough time frame to be worth it. The British were much more aware of things that were going to be good at delivering, because in part they developed a system of managing these resources, both to the manufacturing and afterwards the use of them. So when the Americans get involved, the British finally have the scale that they can use to really get a lot of these things rolling, and nuclear weapons are one of them. So it's a feedback, and the other thing is, you come up with this promise of a bomb that is pound for pound 22 million times more potent than TNT, and you say that to the right people, and they're going to make sure the resources get to that project. So yeah, there's a feedback effect. Both feeds into one another. The nuclear sort of dream encourages the resources that get to it, and the resources that get to it encourage the nuclear dream. The managerialism allows, if you see what I'm saying.
Yeah. I wonder how you would assess today's in today's context then, because it seems like the American government is kind of dabbling in a lot of different projects and investing, like they're spreading out their resources pretty thin
Yeah.
when they're researching, the effect that cocaine has on small birds, right?
Are they?
So would you say that they're still managing the thing well or not?
Yeah. One second. I'm gonna switch chairs. I've got a much more comfortable chair I want to sit in, and it's better for musing. Hold on. This will pay off for everybody. Giving me 30 seconds to do this, because I'll be much better at talking.
It's a musing chair. Yeah. Wait for the prolonged silence, but my daughter's here causing a ruckus, so I'm...
All right, I'm back. Yeah, I have two chairs, and one's like a fairly normal office chair, and the other is sort of this comfortable sort of canopy chair that Purigaya.
By the way, Yasuke says your mic is a bit quiet.
Okay. How is that? Is that any better? Test.
Yep.
Yeah.
Sounds good.
So Jeff, one of the benefits that we have is Quigley's writing in 1963 about a project that's 20 years old. Most of his information is pretty accurate. There's a few inaccuracies that I've picked up on, but that can be forgiven because of he was much closer to it at a time when this information was a bit more secretive. One of the things is when we learn about things, we have to figure out a way how to read them. So we can talk about things like DARPA, right? That's the weather thing, right? And the extent to which DARPA is about the weather is it's not DARPA. What's the one I'm thinking of? The weather
Part of DARPA.
Isn't it?
Yeah.
I'm thinking there's
that should be part of DARPA.
Okay. So but DARPA is the research something, the defense. There's something within DARPA. Well, I can't remember the name I'm thinking of. It might. All right. So, like, the extent to which something is...
Oh, it's HARP.
HARP.
HAARP.
Yeah. HARP is an example. What's the... I just had it in my head. The LSD mind control thing.
MK Ultra.
MK Ultra. Right, so the U.S. government and these agencies can say, we're investigating mind control, or we're investigating manipulation of the weather, or that can get out, that can leak, and you have to take it with a grain of salt, because at one level, I don't think it's a lie. I think it's like true. I don't think it's like a false flag information release. Very often, I think there's very often something there, but MK Ultra, like, the impulse is to go like mind control, like they can zap our minds with something, but when in actuality it might not be that sci-fi. It might be a bit different. It might be you know, fluoride in the water. So the extent to which these programs are like science fiction, and to the extent that they're mundane, is what I'm talking about. Now, the mundane can also be very effective, right? I'm not saying it's not about the effectiveness of the end use. It's about being susceptible to falling into like some science fiction world that is where the misdirect could exist. The misdirect could exist that they think that they want you to think that they have the DoD has, you know, batteries of psychers. Now, but then again, they could also be doing things that are really, really quite science fiction-y, right? Like, we know, like, bombarding people with, like, sonar, with, like, high frequencies can, like, radically alter their moods and make them very respond in different ways. So the stuff that you're talking about, the extent to which it's true, it's always true, but like how true in what way, if you see what I'm saying.
Okay.
So, yeah, I just like this. My favorite one is that one on the top right, because it makes me look like a sort of a Hobbit, Henry Cavill, Doctor Who.
I didn't pick that one because we're holding hands.
We're friends. In last week's one, didn't you have your arm around my shoulder?
That's different. Well, I don't know. We live in different times.
Do they not hold? Do men not hold hands in Asia, or in Canada, or in Vancouver? Is Vancouver
In
is
Canada,
Vancouver part of is Vancouver part of Asia yet? Yeah, I thought these are some of the better images that have been generated for me, so I like them. I like them all. Today is, though, episode 12. The name of the chapter is The New Age. This is chapter 16. There are 4 more chapters, but I might next week actually talk about the development of the nuclear bomb in a more technical and in-depth way. I haven't, quickly, because a lot of technical information in this one, and I don't have a lot on it. It depends what you think, Jeff, and whether I'm happy with getting across enough information. But then it is also maybe there's more to in the next 4 chapters to do as well. But yeah, this is chapter 16. 4 more chapters after this, and yeah. So it's I think next one is the one that they talk about the Anglo-American establishment, I think. So yeah, last time we did the Second World War. I really enjoyed it because I'm a nerd, and the Second World War is probably one of my oldest obsessions. My grandmother lived through it, and I spent a lot of time with her in the summers, and she would talk about it a lot. So I have that sort of connection, and yeah, got taken to museums and that sort of thing, and on breaks. So the Imperial War Museum in London specifically was one of my favorites. Lots of cool stuff there. But that's pretty much all we did. It was the Second World War. This chapter takes place during that same time frame, but it's a bit more behind the scenes. Not as much about the war itself, but about the cultural change, the new paradigm that came up, the emergence of operational research, which is managerialism, and how that became cemented as the it finally kind of like establishes itself. It's there before in ways, but it properly emerges as a science in this time. And then the development of nuclear weapons and the impact of that after in the war and immediately after. So let's see. So this is I've got some pictures up here. Quigley talks about initially these changes in our history, these rhythms that we've been living with, and the way that things swing back and forth. And you get in these major moments of Western history. So in the top left, that is medieval scholastics. Beneath them is Erasmus. In the top middle are some Puritans in America. And on the bottom is some, I can't remember the painting, but that's the Enlightenment. The top right is the Darwinist account of man, and underneath that is the YouTube-friendly totalitarian. So now each of these pictures represents a significant era of Western history. We have medieval scholasticism, and then the reaction to medieval scholasticism is Erasmus's humanism. And then the Puritans, in many ways, are a reaction to humanism. And Quigley doesn't talk about the Enlightenment, and I think sort of a glaring omission. But I think the Enlightenment's a reaction to Puritanism, and then there's some relationship with materialism and the Enlightenment. I don't think it's fair to say the Enlightenment was materialist. And then this sort of the rationalism of the 19th century. You know, I said this before. We have the tendency to think like, well, everything before us was irrational, and we are moving this Whiggish concept of history. We're becoming more and more rational. Quigley says, no, the 20th century was a reaction against rationalism. So all of these are reacting. They're all reactions against what came before them, but each leaves their mark. You don't, and there's also a way in which you can, the return meme, right? Like return to monkey or return to the pre-Enlightenment. I have a lot of sympathy for that, but I don't think that is a productive path for us. I think, unfortunately, we just have to accept where we are. And we need to... As
you like to say sometimes, Pandora's box gets opened, and there's no putting the stuff back in.
Yeah. And, like, humanism, right? you can complain about humanism until you discover what post-humanism is. And post-humanism is not great. It's not terrible in comparison. And there's transhumanism. And transhumanism is like, in many ways, like superhumanism, but like cursed humanism as well. You don't, and you don't want to undo it. I also don't really, I don't want to undo the Enlightenment, really. There's problems with the way the Enlightenment has gone since like Mill, but I don't think the Enlightenment is inherently bad. Now maybe you can say something similar about materialism. I'm not against. Again, I'm not really against naturalism. I'm against naturalism insofar as we use that term to mean a denial of God, but I'm not against naturalism as sort of a method and a way, an approach to the formation of knowledge. So I think I just.
Sometimes you hear this in the Orthodox world. We want to think about things in terms of how can we bring them into the church? How can we baptize them? So, for example, how Platonism might have influenced, or how we might have borrowed a number of concepts from Platonism, and we recontextualize them in a Christian sense. So it's the same thing with naturalism or with Enlightenment ideas. If there's a way to figure out how we recontextualize them in Christ, that's the way forward.
Yeah, and I think that there is in some way. What that looks like, I don't know. At the moment, I couldn't say. But I agree. I mean, that's a good way of putting it, right? Those on the side, those Christians of all types, Orthodox, Protestant, and Catholic, of every type, want to make an argument that the church baptized the Roman Empire into Christianity, and many, especially many Baptists, and those of the Baptist persuasion, want to say no, we didn't. There's something there. I know Orthodox that want to say, like, in a way, the bringing the Roman Empire in was a mistake. The Catholics can't say that because the Catholics are the Roman Empire, in many ways surviving, which I don't think is a.
Well, we consider Byzantium to be the real Roman Empire,
right,
or the continuation of the Roman Empire.
Yeah. So there's what I mean is, like, a Catholic that says the Roman Empire was bad and we shouldn't have baptized it in is weird insofar as, like, the Western Church adhered to a imperial sort of political format in a way that the Eastern Church was still in an empire, whereas the Western Church sort of became the empire, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
So the extent to which, so that's the example I hear a lot, the Roman Empire. But there's one picture I want to talk about in particular on here, and that's that top middle one, the Puritanism, because Puritanism, all of these leave their mark on where we are now. We can all see the fingerprints of them, but it's that Puritanism, which is the one that really influences the middle class. And the middle class has been, in many ways, driving history for the last 300 years in a way that the others haven't. So I want to read here. There's a lot of good bits in this chapter. I'm just going to read the first page here. Hopefully it won't take too long. Any war performs two contradictory services for the social context in which it occurs. On the one hand, it changes the minds of men, especially defeated, about the factual power relationship between the combatants. And, on the other hand, it alters the factual situation itself, so that changes which in peacetime might have occurred over decades are brought about in a few years. This has been true of all wars, but never has it been truer than in respect to the Second World War. The age which began in 1945 was a new age from almost every point of view. Looking back, it is now clear that the first generation of the 20th century, from about 1895 to 1939, was a long period of transition from the 19th century world to a totally different world of the 20th century. Some of these changes are obvious. A shift from a period of democracy to an age of experts. From a world dominated by Europe and even by Britain to a world divided into three great power blocks. From a world in which man still lived as he had for 1,000,000 years, surrounded by nature, to a situation where nature is dominated, transformed, and, in a sense, totally destroyed by man. From a system where man's greatest problems were the material ones of man's helplessness in the face of the natural threats of disease, starvation, and the unpredictability of natural catastrophes, to the totally different system of the 1960s and 70s, where the greatest threat to man is man himself, referring to the nuclear bomb, and where his greatest problems are the social and non-material ones of what his true goals of existence are, and what use he should make of his immense power over the universe, including his fellow men. For thousands of years, some men had viewed themselves as creatures a little lower than the angels or even God, and a little higher than the beasts. Now, in the 20th century, man has acquired almost divine powers, and it has become increasingly clear that he can no longer regard himself as an animal, as the leading thinkers of the 19th century did, but must regard himself as at least a man, if he cannot bring himself to break so completely with his 19th century predecessors as to come to regard himself as obligated to act like an angel or even a god. The whole trend of the 19th century has been to emphasize man's animal nature, and in doing so to seek to increase his supply of material necessities, his indulgence in creature comforts, his experiences of food, movement, sex, and emotion. This effort has resulted in the sharp curtailment of almost total neglect of the conventions of man's earlier history, conventions which had been, on the whole, based on a conception of man as a dualistic creature in which an eternal spiritual soul was encased temporarily in an ephemeral material body. This older conception has been embodied in the form in which the 19th century challenged it, largely in the 17th century, and has been reflected in that earlier period in the widespread influence of Puritanism, of Jansenism, and of other basically pessimistic, inhibiting, masochistic, and self-disciplining ideologies. The 18th century had been a long age of struggle to get free of this older 17th century outlook, and had been so prolonged largely because those who turned away from the 17th century could neither envisage nor agree upon the newer ideology they wanted to put in place of the older one they wished to reject. I couldn't really summarize that, so I thought it was better just to read it. Do you any thoughts on that passage, Jeff?
There's a lot there to break down.
Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe keep going. We'll circle back to it.
Right. So, and then around 1900, quickly says, we reach this reaction to this pressure, these efforts of rationality. And in many ways, totalitarianism is that result. Where Quigley would place Marxist sort of utopianism, I don't know. With the benefit of knowing that the Soviet Union collapses, Quigley didn't know that that was going to happen, obviously. But where he would place them, I don't know. But fascism and Nazism, he says, are irrational. And what the Second World War represents in a sort of a history of ideas analysis, is the victory of rationality over irrationality, which Quigley thinks is good. Quigley is sort of here really...
But would you say, though, that both fascism and socialism are attempts at rationalism?
Attempts at I don't think rationalism... I certainly think socialism is, in some ways, more so than fascism. I don't think fascism is. I don't. Yeah. I don't think fascists would try to claim rationality. They're more about something. Now Quigley is kind of using irrationality here as a in a pejorative sense, but if we're to sort of take it away from that and talking about fascism as irrational but without any necessarily negative connotations, I think you can say that fascists are irrational. There's a sort of like a will, and that the will can overcome or create a rationality of its own, that you can sort of make the world in a certain way. Overcome it.
Yeah, but they don't. I guess. Yeah, I can see that they don't try to systematize it. Therefore, it's not entirely. It's more rational leaning, I guess.
It's very difficult.
There is a system of. Yeah. Like fascism does have a system, but within that system, there is this room for this personalized dimension, this kind of spirit dimension, where it's like. The needs of the nation right now are different from the needs of the nation tomorrow, and we need the will represented in a person. It's personalized.
Yeah.
Whereas with socialism, it's like this is the system for all time, for all people. Yeah.
Well, that's one of the things
after the Glorious Revolution.
Yeah, that's one of the things Neo Markey says in his book. The one that deals with the factionalism of the Third Reich, that the advantage fascism had over socialism was that for fascism, ideology was captured in the leader, and so the leader could be much more adaptable to circumstances and could shape the policies to how they need to be that day. And that's what he calls charismatic leadership. The Marxism, those sort of ideologies close to Marxism, the legitimacy of the leader is derived from his adherence to one ideology. So ideology is captured in the charisma of the fascist leader, whereas the communist leader always has to be showing why ideologically he's actually like the best communist, or at least like ideologically sound. So the fascists have an advantage there, I think, in the way that they sell themselves. I suppose there's it's not inconceivable that there could be left-wing charismatic leadership, legitimacy. Neo Markey talks about legitimacy, but I can't think of what it would look like at the moment. I mean, maybe the Kims would have something like that. I don't know how much they're.
Yeah. But I think one of the keys here is actually that the fascists have an understanding that the will of the people actually has to be embodied in a person. It's almost like a family understanding that the will of the family has to be embodied by the father.
Yeah.
Whereas with socialism, it's this understanding that, the father is only legitimate if he follows the the instruction manual on how to be a dad, and that it's actually not important. He's actually not the important thing. It's rather the instruction manual that's important.
Yeah, yeah. You can talk more to that than I can, but it makes sense. Uh, I think the problem particularly comes up it's not so much with the left but with Marxism, because Marxists are trying to commit themselves to this model that Marx gave. As to the dad stuff, I mean, I agree, it makes sense, but yeah. So, what was I saying? So, in many ways, we can sort of treat the Second World War as a sort of as a civil war in the West between between the powers of rationalism and irrationalism. There's a sort of but Quigley really emphasizes a lot of this is pushing against the irrationalism in many ways is pushing against a sort of bourgeois middle class puritanism that lingers on.
Was Puritanism rationalist or irrationalist?
It's rational. It's certainly more rational than because the particular thing. I'll read this little passage. We shall speak later of these essential features of the 19th century point of view, because their disappearance in the 20th century, associated as it is with the crisis of the middle classes, is an essential part of the crisis of the 20th century, where it is to be seen most clearly in the English-speaking and Scandinavian countries. We shall call these features as a single bundle future preference, and understand that it includes the gospel of saving, of work, and of postponed enjoyment, consumption, and leisure. Closely related to it is a somewhat different idea based on a constant and irremediable dissatisfaction with one's present position and present possessions. This is associated with the 19th century's emphasis on acquisitive behavior, on achievement, and on an infinitely expansible demand, and is equally associated with the middle class outlook. Both of these together, future preference and expansible material demands, were basic features in the 19th century middle class society, and indispensable foundations for its great material achievements. They are inevitably lacking in backward, tribal, underdeveloped peasant societies and groups, not only in Africa and Asia, but in many peripheral areas and groups of Western civilization, including much of the Mediterranean, Latin America, Central France, or in the Mennonite communities of southern Pennsylvania and elsewhere. The lack of future preference and expansible materials in other areas and the weakening of them in the middle-class Western civilization are essential features of the 20th century crisis. So that those Puritan values feeding in to the mastery of materialism that comes in the 19th century create the middle class, and the First World War and the Great Depression and the expansion of competition in places outside of basically WASP areas starts to undermine the middle class sense and the middle class sort of path, and that is creates grounds for an irrational emotive response. And Germany goes one way and Britain and America go in another way. So yeah, so one of the things Quigley wants to say is not only are the Allies rational and the Axis irrational, but the Allies won because they were rational. He says the Allies won because they represented the values of Western civilization and the values that had made the Western civilization the most powerful to exist in the 6,000-year history of civilization. And it's rationalism, science, diversity, freedom, and voluntary cooperation. Now, by diversity there, I don't take Quigley to mean like infinite Bomalians coming in. I think he means more diversity of ideas and the ability to engage in dialogue and not have some top-down enforced dogma.
The marketplace of ideas.
The marketplace of ideas. The Republic of Letters. The marketplace of ideas. So, in particular, the Allies win because of rationalism and science. Quigley says that men prior to the Second World War benefited from science and technology, but they don't really come into contact with it. It's in the Second World War that you have them really coming into contact with it, and afterwards it never goes away. So, and those are just some pictures. The one in the top left just sort of, I think, captures the sort of clean cut, fairly. There's something about the march of progress to it that captured me. And I put it, whereas like there's something fairly medieval to that Japanese poster. And then those are just some women working at primitive computers, I take it. I think that's from the Manhattan Project, those women.
Oh, okay. Yeah, one thought that comes to mind to give people to kind of think about why systems are so powerful, why rationalism and the science of managerialism or scientific governance is so powerful. You can think about it in terms of games like chess, for example. The top players in chess, they all understand what the significance of various opening moves. Yes. They have it all systematized. Whereas an amateur chess player goes into the chess game and is like, oh, I feel like moving this pawn. And they don't fully understand all of the technical implications of that. So that's why, sometimes the instinct player can do something unpredictable, but ultimately, when things are systematized, that's a very powerful tool that
in some ways
things like warfare.
In some ways, I sort of imagine what most high-level chess games are is some sort of what the first sort of 3-4 turns represent are more sort of conversation about what sort of chess game we're going to play, because they're also it's so formalized, and it's more like, well, we've got this deck of chess games that we can play. We'll just sort of go through the forms of the early game, and then whatever turn it is that the early game formalities break down, that's really when the game begins. That's how I would sort of think of it. And I don't know what that, but games is exactly the right way to be thinking about this, because one of the areas that really gets managerialism going is game theory, which is about how actors optimize their outcomes based upon the rationality of their choices. And that is managerialism, really. Managerialism is how do we most efficiently and effectively use a set of limited resources to maximize our outcomes. Now, I've got some pictures here. These pictures capture the big areas of what is done with managerialism in the Second World War. Now I'm gonna stop using the word managerialism and I'm gonna start using the word operational research. Operational research is this managerial. I'm not gonna stop using managerialism. I'm gonna hop back and forth. But when I use operational research, I'm talking about managerialism. Managerialism is a science. It is rational and logical. It is formalized. It is studied. And there's a couple of guys that sort of developed the field. Neumann develops game theory. There's Frederick Winslow Taylor develops the principles of scientific management, the rights of scientific management. Arthur D. Little Incorporated, they do a lot with it. The guy that really gets operational research off the ground, though, in an applied way, is Professor Patrick Blackett, who is British. Now, one of the things that's going to keep coming up, again, in the Bucklander British propaganda series, time and again, is the British are the ones who really innovate, and the Americans then pick it up and run with it and apply it at scale. And this is no different. The British develop operational research, but it's really the Americans that get it off the ground. But there's some really good examples in the book. So the one that Quigley really gives in depth is U-boats. So I have those U-boats up. Those are some captured U-boats at the end of the war that the Allies are, I think they're going to sink. But the realization is, if we can be cold and logical and rational about this, we can fight the war better than some emotional response. And the way to think about this is U-boats versus bombing. And what Quigley has to tell us really further condemns the bombing campaign as not just horrible. We already knew it was horrible, but it wasn't even worth it. It didn't even accomplish anything really of value. And there are problems with the bombing campaign I'll get to, but the British had sub-hunters, right? Aircraft that would patrol the North Atlantic, the North Sea, those areas where they could operate, large bomber planes, and look for subs but operate from land bases. And there's something that's very interesting, because what operational research does, Quigley says, is rather than innovate something new, which is what science does, operational research maximizes the pre-existing. So the British were running these bombers off of their air bases in Britain and Northern Ireland. The Irish were neutral. Ireland's not in this war. The Irish are neutral. And the British had their depth charges on these bomber planes set to 100 feet. Now, operational research, for some reason or another, turned its attention to this. The idea was that 100 feet, which means by the time it gets down to 100 feet underneath the surface, the depth charge explodes from the pressure. It kind of can sense the pressure, and it explodes. So the way they figured this 100 feet out was the time interval the plane spots the sub, the speed of the plane, and the speed of the submergence of the submarine. And they figured that about 100 feet down was roughly where the sub would be on average in a response to seeing the airplane roughly at the same time as the airplane sees it. But the problem is, if the depth charge goes off more than 20 feet away from the sub, it's unlikely that the sub is going to be affected. So you've got to make sure that you have your depth charges set in the best range possible to sink these subs, because the subs are causing a lot of damage to British shipping. So what operational research said was, through mathematics and game theories, was right. If we're going after all subs, we're not going to sink many with 100 feet depth charge, because that 100 feet represents 100 feet worth of time, the amount of time it takes a sub to get down. Now, what if we cut down our fuses? What if we cut our fuses down to 25 feet, but we ignore subs that are very far away, and we only go after subs that are close by, that are going to be within that 25 feet? Because that 100, the more time that elapses, the more variability there's going to be in the U-boat and its location and its depth. Because remember, that 20 feet's not just up or down, it's left, right, back, forward. So what they do is they say, cut it down to 25 feet and only go for the low-hanging fruit, basically. As a result, 30, yeah. As a result, the British coastal command bombers increase their impact on subs by 400%, because they're much better at getting the ones close by, and they just assume they're not going to get the ones far away. There's a number of things like this. There's the examples Quigley gives is it better to so Jeff, let's test your intuition here. Is it better with anti-aircraft guns and a city, right? Is it better to have the anti-aircraft guns spread out thinly throughout the city and imperfectly protect the whole city, or is it better to perfectly protect certain districts of the city? What decreases casualties and increases aircraft shot down? What do you think? What do you think is the better strategy?
It sounds like one of those choices where there's a trade-off each way, but what you seem to be implying is that one is the optimal strategy.
Yeah, one is better.
Right. I guess it would be the focused one instead of spreading them out.
Yes. Yeah. So there's a number of things like this that are slightly counterintuitive, because I would have thought generally, actually, you'd want to make the airspace over a city more hostile in general. But I think the logic of it would be something like, each aircraft can absorb a certain amount of damage, but by concentrating your fire, you're going to bring down more aircraft instead of having more aircraft damaged, but not damaged enough to bring them down. If you see if that makes sense.
Okay.
And so it's easier to bring down an already weakened bomber. Another one that's weird that I couldn't figure out might have something to do with
when
clouds.
I was thinking about that one, I was kind of thinking in the context of tower defense games.
Yeah. Okay.
You don't want to just spread your turrets out everywhere. You want to kind of focus in on an area, a high traffic area.
Yeah. Get some synergies going.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
so another one, the one that I couldn't figure out was that repainting bombers from black to white, when used on submarine patrol, you repainting night bombers from black to white when on sub patrol, increased the sightings of submarines by 30%. So something about white made the bombers weirdly less visible to the subs. Um, uh, are small convoys safer? Are many small convoys safer, or are fewer large convoys safer? Jeff, which do you think?
Um, Intuitively, you would think small convoys are safer, but I'm guessing here it's the large one, isn't it?
Yeah, so large using large ones um, cuts uh, um, the U-boat's ability to sink ships in half. So you have a loss rate of 2.5% in small convoys and a loss rate of 1.1% in large convoys. And it has to do with the density of escort vessels on the perimeter. So on larger, more concentrated convoys, you have more destroyers escorting them, and the perimeter is does not scale. The perimeter vessels can much more easily like get a density of protection around than dividing themselves up around smaller convoys. And that what that looks like is that had large convoys been started in 1942, in the spring of 1942, which is a year before they do. If in the year if this tactic had started a year earlier, that would have looked like 200 ships, 200 merchant vessel ships saved, that were lost that because of this policy. And here's one more: is it better to let's see, with an inadequate number of patrol planes, is it better to search the whole patrol area some days, or to search part of it every day with whatever planes were available? So do you want to saturate the search area, only on a few days, or do you want a lower intensity but persistent search?
For me, I would take the lower intensity persistent search
That's
because
true.
it seems more like how radar works.
Yeah, so we're not. So radar does come in, but like you don't. There's some weird ones, like they discover that that the number of sightings on the left hand side of airplanes are 30% higher than on the right hand side when looking for U-boats. And there's little things that add up. And the reason why you make 30% more sightings out of the left hand side of the plane is because the co-pilot sits on the left hand side, and the co-pilot very often doesn't have anything to do. So the co-pilot is looking out the window as well. And so what they do is they redistribute the crew, and they put an extra guy on the right hand side, and the number of sub sightings goes up because they're more evenly balancing their search, because they now know they can factor in the co-pilot. Now, so this is all operational research. This is what operational research is doing. Thinking about this, The night bombing, which the British innovate, this isn't all propaganda. The night bombing is the worst thing that the British do in the entire war. Dresden, I can't remember. It's thousands of people die in Dresden for no benefit. The attitude is, if we demoralize the civilian population, we can win the war more easily. The British cabinet, someone in the cabinet who's able to make these sorts of decisions, creates this preference for military targets in high density, surrounded by factory worker housing, so that you hit the military target. But if you don't hit the military target, don't worry, bonus points. You've hit some factory workers. So it's really it's kind of terrible. But Quigley tells us, if we'd applied operational research to the night bombing campaign, there would have been no reason to do it. Maybe jumping ahead of myself here. But let's have a look. Let me see. Oh, I can't find this page now. But it's just not worth it. It's like a best case scenario. The British were killing. Oh, here we go. Operational research using the German bombing of Britain as a base calculated the number of people killed per tons of bombs dropped, and applied this to Germany to show that the casualties inflicted on Germany were about 400 civilians killed per month. About half the German automobile accident death rate. We should have given them more cars. That's how it would have been more effective. While 200 RAF crewmen were killed per month. So every month you were killing two civilians of Germany for every RAF crewman. That's not a good trade. Such bombing could never influence the outcome of the war. Later it was discovered that the raids were really killing only 200 German civilians a month. So it was a one-for-one exchange, and they were a contribution to a German victory. These estimates made it advisable to shift planes from bombing Germany to U-boat patrol, so that the German submarine war, which was really strangling Britain, could be brought under control. A bomber, in its average life of 30 missions, dropped 100 tons of bombs on Germany, killing 20 Germans and destroying a few houses. The same plane in 30 missions of submarine patrol saved, on the average, 6 loaded merchant vessels and their crews from submarines. As might be expected, this discovery was violently resisted by the head of the RAF Bomber Command, Chief Marshal Sir Arthur Bomber Harris. I hate air forces now. After reading this book, I hate both the RAF and the American Air Force. Both have this demonic personalities in charge. And we're going to talk about the American one in a minute. The Battle of Britain, the fighter pilots that went up, the bomber pilots that went up, they were doing their job. It's the guys that wanted blood. And a lot of these bombing chiefs wanted blood. As I mentioned last time, a lot of people have suggested it wasn't an accident that Nagasaki, the most Christian city in Japan, was the target of a nuclear weapon. And in some ways, Nagasaki was a mass blood sacrifice of Christians. A lot of these guys are not super Christian. A lot of these sorts of level of guys are vaguely deist. I'm quite certain, I can't say this with absolute certainty, but I feel very safe making a blind assertion that a lot of these guys are deistic and basically Masons. So a lot of
So there's just something about Air Force that has this there's this angel of the Air Force that draws a certain type of personality to it.
I think, yeah,
and
they're
kind
able
of
to exert
creates a
something.
pattern of behavior, perhaps.
Right, and so I've got the
Yeah.
Rand Corporation down there. The Rand Corporation is deeply involved with operational research, and it starts as a branch, basically, of the U.S. Air Force. Now, Jeff, I have not been able to do proper research on the Rand Corporation yet, but I think you know a bit about it. Am I right?
I don't know too much about it. Not too many of the details. I know that they are deeply involved in research regarding psychological warfare and things like that.
Right, and that's
And they put
that's
out
part of
a lot of these white, yeah, put out a lot of white papers that
psychological
end up
warfare
being.
is well within the bounds of operational research, because you can do this sort of equation of like, well, if we per 10,000 leaflets dropped, we get one guy to desert. So if we drop, 10 million leaflets, we'll decrease the military capabilities of somewhere by 1%. And then, well, we could target, and we can psychologically, target one area and decrease its military capabilities by 2%. And then when you snowball that with this and this and this, and you make, that's how you leverage surgical action, because you're then able to, like, if you can weaken a part of a nation's capabilities, if you can weaken it mentally, technologically, structurally. By structurally, I mean like the sort of command structure, the communications, right? You can find yourself in a way where you've created a back door. So psychological warfare is very, very much within the range of operational research. Basically, though, I just want to say again, night bombing was not worth it. Bombing civilians was not worth it. There was all sorts of shady things that went on, whereby the British and Americans could have bombed bottleneck manufacturing, but they didn't, and they bombed factories next door to things that represented bottlenecks, because it would be things like the Ford Motor Company had built a factory in Germany in the 30s, and the suggestion was that the Ford Motor Company wanted to go in and reclaim that factory after the war. But it's not that far a leap to go into conspiracy theories, right? Of controlled opposition, manufacturing, sources of materials and funding, getting their way in around borders. And I think really what you start to see is the creation of, like, the nation as a front for big corporations. I don't know what you think of that, Jeff, but that's sort of that's one of the things I kind of like. I get from Quigley. I'm not sure Quigley wants us to get that, but like our guys, knowing what we know in 2023, the history of the, Quigley gives us some real insights up till the mid 60s, and then guys like Sutton give us a lot of insights up to the 80s. And then the problem is the guys from like Sutton onwards, there isn't really a sane, cool, rational voice giving us a big history since, like, I don't know, the 80s. So we got to rely on like Alex Jones, who might be a misdirect because of how vocal he is. But then, like, how do you get attention in this age? But like I kind of want to say like when I learn about this stuff, when I learn about bombing targets and what goes on with bombing targets, and in light of the sort of financial and corporate chicanery that goes on before the war, just in what Quigley tells us, I don't think it's insane to start to think of the nation as a front for corporations. That corporations.
I've been playing around with this idea of the Leviathan. I learned recently that the word Leviathan, the name actually means to twist or to coil. And so the Leviathan is this beast that emerges out of this. It's an underwater beast, right? It's a marine dragon with many heads, quite often depicted with many heads. And the way that I understand it is that in the same sense, corporate interests start to intertwine. Large institutions, they have interests that are shared mutually, but are also like kind of synergistic or symbiotic. So it kind of, as these interests kind of coil together, they become a Leviathan. In the sense that it's a thing that you can't really pick out because it lives in the deep, right? It's kind of shrouded by the ocean, but at the same time it has these many heads, which you can think of as the different corporate interests, the different corporations, right? It has many heads, and at the same time it is this cohesive one thing that is coiled together.
Were you thinking about that in reference to the earlier episodes, or were you thinking about that in reference to something else? Because Quigley does talk about how financial capitalism gets bankers on the heads of the boards of multiple companies, and then out of that the bankers start to unify their interests and make large conglomerates, and they're sort of were you thinking about that, or were you thinking about something else?
Well, the reason why I looked it up was actually something that we were talking about on Discord last week. I can't remember exactly what it was, but it could once again it's this kind of a number of things coiling together and leading me down this rabbit hole. But that is a very common pattern. Like things coil together, right, and they become this thing. They take on a life of their own.
Yeah. We can go on and on. But I want to get through this. We still a little bit to go. So out of this comes the creation of these like funding bodies, which are to research the most effective use of what's working and to target funding towards it. And you have things like the National Academy of Sciences, the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics. Have you heard of Vannevar Bush? I don't know. I don't think he's related to the Bushes, but he's a name I come across every now and then. He's involved. The National Defense but Vannevar Bush sets up something called the National Defense Research Committee. They get funding. There's the Office of Scientific Research and Development, and these are all these councils that sort of start to snowball, and they get money, and they're sending it wherever they sort of want. John D. Rockefeller Jr. is involved. At one point, I think the National Defense Research Committee, which is another one of these, if I haven't mentioned that one already, the NDRC can't get enough funding because Congress is sort of not going fast enough. So the NDRC goes to MIT, which is where Vannevar Bush was, and they go to John D. Rockefeller, and they just go, hey, can we get $500,000 from each of you? And they just go, yeah, sure. So MIT and John D. Rockefeller Jr. each give $500,000 to the NDRC just to grease the wheels of this process, to keep it going. This is the example of, I said, the British develop, the Americans run with it. The Americans take this like funding and this brute sort of force just scale that they can achieve, and they just go with it. The Germans never really develop anything like operational research. They do develop, I can't remember what it's called. They develop something that's very similar in spirit, but which is never applied blanket wide to the whole war. It's more done it's like Krieg studies or Krieg science, something like that. And it's more like at the tactical level. And I think that one of the ways, the British are always much better at maintaining a strategic view than anybody else. And I think that I would include the Americans in that. The British are the masters of monitoring a whole war and monitoring the continent of Europe and playing these games of trade-offs. The Americans are very frustrated with Churchill because Churchill wants to apply this sort of game of, death by 1,000 cuts, because that is the way the British have always done it. They can show up with their navy and drop some troops in Spain and Portugal and open up a second front that bleeds Napoleon dry. Well, Churchill wants to do that again. The Americans are much more impatient. The Americans want to just go straight at it. And there's this fundamental problem. I didn't really talk about it last week. There's this problem between Americans and the British. And the Americans, I was watching Band of Brothers, and the 101st Screaming Eagles participate in a British-led operation called Operation Market Garden. There's a really good movie about it called A Bridge Too Far. And the 101st Screaming Eagle E Company finds out, we're under the command of the British, and they all groan because the British have this reputation of being not the best. Well, it's not that the British are bad. In fact, there's a strong case to be made that the British are better at fighting these wars than the Americans. It's just that they have a different philosophy guiding them. The Americans believe in hitting as big and as hard as possible to end the war sooner. And that might mean losing more men per day, but in the long run will mean less men die overall. The British really believe in strategy and tactics and maneuver. And the guy who led Operation Market Garden was Marshal Bernard Montgomery, who gets a lot of hate from Americans who I don't think they understand him. I don't think they understand the way that he fought. And his great rival was Patton. And Churchill could see control of the war was being lost to the Americans, and he puts pressure on Montgomery to come up with a really daring plan, and that's not Montgomery's style at all. And in fact, Montgomery comes up with this plan, Operation Market Garden, which works except for the failure of the American 101st Screaming Eagles, who are unable to capture their objective, and the plan falls apart. But it was very much just sort of like against his will, because the Americans remember back to Montgomery was trying to capture Caen in Normandy, and he takes far too long by the American opinions to take it, because he's methodical. He wants to fight in as slow and methodical a way as possible, and it goes to the old maxim. And in fact, I think Montgomery kind of develops his own twist on it, maybe, which is that there's battles are won by a combination of maneuver and bloodshed, and the more maneuver, the less bloodshed. And so I think that is Montgomery said that. The more you maneuver, the less blood needs to be shed, and therefore theoretically the perfect battle is one that is won entirely by maneuver and with no bloodshed, at least on your own part. And the Americans don't really appreciate that approach. And anyway, that's one of my tangents. But what was the point of that? The British are very good at maintaining a strategic perspective on things, and that even goes for the post-war. The FDR has no fucking idea what he's doing. He is a naive child who has no idea what he's doing with the Russians, and Churchill must have been in agony trying to drag FDR into trying to give him some sense. And as I said last time, I think Churchill probably, like, he knew FDR was far more on his side than Stalin, but I wouldn't be surprised to hear Churchill say, like, he found it much easier to deal with Stalin because they were both speaking the same language. He knew what Stalin was, Stalin knew what Churchill was, but they were both fairly realist. Whereas FDR was living in this, like, fantasy land. The Americans were living in this fantasy land of what the post-war world would look like. I think Truman is it's quite good that FDR dies when he does, in many ways, because Truman is a much more realistic president. So yeah, you get the Rand Corporation. The Rand Corporation, I believe, is involved with something called Operation Bootstrap. Operation Bootstrap is an effort to industrialize Puerto Rico. It works, but I had a little look, and it took me about 30 seconds to find the dark, demonic side of Operation Bootstrap, which was they coerced Puerto Ricans into getting sterilized because they thought that a big part of Puerto Rico's problem was they're having too many babies. Neumann develops game theory, which is a big part of this. Again, the British develop, and the Americans run with it. Now quickly transitions from operational research to the nuclear. Now, again, this sort of management stuff feeds into the ability to produce the nuclear, as I said at the beginning. There's a lot of technical detail here, and I'd like to do a real story about the development of the nuclear bomb, because there's a lot that goes on, and particularly for a non-American audience, there's a lot that I think Canadians, Brits, and the the Australians and New Zealanders should know about the development of the nuclear weapons and how America betrays us. In particularly, who's the prime minister at the time in 1940? Do you know who was it? Mackenzie in 1945 of Canada? Jeff, Canadian trivia time. Canadian prime ministers. Renegade, do you know?
Correct. Yep.
So
you're correct. It's Mackenzie.
Mackenzie and Attlee, the British prime minister at the end of the war, go down to Washington. Attlee comes over, meets Mackenzie in Ottawa, and they have this little meeting because the Canadians are almost like an equal partner in the development of the nuclear weapons, and they go down, and the Americans just like ignore them. The Americans, the British, when it's like 1940, 1941, the British and Americans agree to merge their nuclear weapons program. because there's a real concern the Germans are going to beat them to the development of the bomb. The British program is called tube alloys. And the British are shocked because they're more advanced in 1940, 1941 than the Americans are. And they have the theoretical basis for the bomb laid down. And the Americans don't. And so, in very many ways, the nuclear bomb represents British theory being implemented with American muscle. And I include a lot of the nuclear scientists from Europe in with the British. I believe more of them were in Britain than in America. They really jumped in. The American side of the theory was not well developed at all. And the agreement was that whatever was developed was going to be shared. Now, the Americans decide, no, we're not going to do that. We're gonna betray our word. We're gonna break our word, and we're gonna go back on that. And we're going to we're gonna make it illegal by U.S. law to share this information with the British. Now, on the face of it, I have heard the excuse very often that that's because the British leaked. The British leaked more, blah blah blah, and the British spread the information to the Soviets. That is not true. The British did not substantially leak more to the Soviets than the Americans did. We know this now. Quigley didn't at the time that he wrote, and the British were aware that they were very quickly getting left behind. And the Soviets developed their bomb. And I'm not a fan of Attlee and his government, but they did keep the nuclear weapon program going. And what did it? This was I found this great little quote earlier today. Let's see. Here we go. So this is who is this speaking? I can't remember whose entry this is of his who this is who said this. But he says this is the cabinet, the British cabinet is getting together. Are we going to continue Are we going to continue a British nuclear program or are we not? This is October 1946. The war's been over for a year. And this is what whoever this is says. The meeting was about to decide against it on the grounds of cost when Ernest Bevin arrived late and said, quote, "We've got to have this thing. I don't mind it for myself, but I don't want any other foreign secretary of this country to be talked at or to by the Secretary of State of the United States as I've just been in my discussion with Mr. Burns. We've got to have this thing over here, whatever it costs. We've got to have the bloody Union Jack flying on top of it." Now I like that. I like Britain having the bomb to spite America. That if it was for any other reason, I wouldn't give a shit. But that reason's good enough for me. So there's a lot that goes on with this trickery and American betrayals of the nuclear bomb. I think it's a really interesting story. And I think, I don't know if it's worth an episode or not, but I could very easily do one. Maybe after, I don't know. Maybe I'll see what you say, Jeff, and what the sort of thoughts are. But there's a lot there. There's there's some really interesting stories there. But also maybe wait and see what else Quigley says, because there's still we've done now.
Yeah, that seems like it could be an interesting story to tell, because recently the movie Oppenheimer came out in theaters this year, and that's kind of like the American side of the narrative of how the bomb got developed.
Oh, I cannot wait. I can't wait to get to the chapter that Oppenheimer features in for Quigley, because I haven't seen Oppenheimer, but I am so sick of the bullshit of some tortured genius who realized that he'd done something horrible. Because Oppenheimer stays involved with the development of nuclear weapons for another 10 years, and he's so cold and rational about it that he's advocating for a plethora of sizes of nuclear weapons. He's saying we don't need one size of nuclear weapon. We want a whole spectrum to be able to use them in contextual areas, and we'll be more efficient at fighting the Soviets because of this. So he's not saying no bombs. He's not saying like some bombs, but only if we really need it. He's saying no, we need all sorts of bombs. We need bespoke bombs
for everyday use.
For everyday use. And what actually gets Oppenheimer out of the nuclear weapons program is McCarthy, because Oppenheimer has left-wing sympathies. I don't think he was a communist, although that might have changed. The thought on that might have changed. But McCarthy goes after him with the support of the U.S. Air Force, because what the U.S. Air Force wants is it wants a single-size bomb, and it wants a single-size bomb that I think it's the B-36, a plane that never really takes off in terms of like success. It's what exists between the B-29 Superfortress and the B-52 Stratofortress. It's that intermediate bomber that exists in the 50s. The U.S. Air Force wants a fleet of about 700 of these, each able to carry the largest bomb it can take off with. And that, to the U.S. Air Force, is the size of the bomb that we should be developing. And Oppenheimer comes along and he says, no, you're being irrational. We need to be much more logical and rational about our use of nuclear weapons. And they go, no, this is going to take away funding from us and our interests. And so they then leak to McCarthy information to get rid of Oppenheimer. So again, the Air Force is like this weird like doomsday cult of guys. So one of the things that's going to happen is part of the story, and I have it for my notes for today, this last little bit. There's the three branches are entering into a phase of competition with one another: our Air Force, Navy, Army, and each is trying to make a pitch for itself as the branch that deserves the most funding, the dominant branch. And one of the reasons why the U.S. we know this. I can't emphasize enough how much we know this. We did not need to drop the bombs on Japan. We know that we could have beaten the Japanese. We didn't need to invade Japan. We know that the Japanese were on the brink of surrender. But a number of reasons why we dropped the bomb on Japan. I'll just go into that now. There's two problems. The scientists know exactly what the bomb is, but they don't know the situation on the ground. The generals and admirals, the chiefs of staff, know what the situation on the ground is, but they don't know what the bomb is. They think it's just a really big bomb. So no one really knows what it means to use the bomb on Japan, because there's this asymmetry of information on both sides. But the Air Force, and what happens is, there's this thought that like Japan's like 2 or 3 weeks away from surrender, just from blockade. The U.S. Navy is mining harbors outside the Japanese harbors. Japan is really struggling to get in everything that it needs. It's on, and we know they're on the brink of surrender. But what happens is the U.S. Air Force goes, we want to use this bomb to prove that we should continue to exist as a source for funding, as a source to be funded. So they the head of, I can't remember his name now. It's somewhere in the book. The head of Intel for the Pacific Theater knows Japan is on the brink of surrender, and he's telling people the bomb is developed for Germany. It's never developed in the understanding that this would be used against Japan. And when Germany surrenders, the scientists say, like, we don't want to use this. We don't think this should be used against Japan. The Air Force, sort of shames these guys. It says, look, you were anti-Nazi, sure, but you're not anti-Nazi and pro-West. You're anti-Nazi and pro-Soviet. So Germany's beaten. There isn't really a good reason to use it against Japan. But then Quigley suggests that some of the guys at the top think that actually, no, Japan is an even better target for it because they're not white. They're Japanese, and who cares about Japanese people? So the other thing, though, is, and this is the one moment in the book, at least from what I can remember, I can't remember if he does start to get a bit more speculative from here on, but this is about the future. But this is the most that Quigley gets into sort of thinking about counterfactuals. What would have happened if we hadn't used the bomb? Quigley thinks it's unlikely the Soviets would have developed it. That in fact the Soviets developed it because we develop it and the West uses it. They were more advanced. They were actually decently advanced in their atomic energy research, but not for the purposes of a bomb. But the use of the bomb is really about Russia. It's to send a message to Russia by Truman that we're going to use this. And Quigley says, the bomb defines the realpolitik negotiation about Europe and Asia. And had we not used the bomb, the Russians would have probably swept through various places. I think that's bullshit. As I've said before, the U.S.'s ability to produce fighter aircraft alone is indicative of what we could have done. We could have easily, if we just turned the tap on, outproduced Russia in everything other than men. And there's not. The Germans were able to kill 13 or 14 Russians for every German. Imagine what we could have done with bringing the remnant of the Wehrmacht online with Western equipment. I don't think, or the Japanese. There's a reason why the Japanese have not had a military for a long time. They have a defense force. They don't have an offensive military. They ostensibly don't have an offensive military. But we very quickly brought back the West German army. The German Bundeswehr came back very quickly, and their high command had all served in the Second World War with the bad guys. So, and that was to create a bulwark against the Soviets. I think that the Red Terror was just that. It was a psychological manipulator to keep the West in line, and it wasn't really. Excuse me. I read Operation Gladio this week, and Jeff, my reading of Operation Gladio is not the good guy versus the bad guy. It's the bad guy versus the bad guy. And we should not fall into a false dichotomy of thinking that because the CIA funded groups that we call far right, that we should think of as our guys. Those groups that the CIA funded were like just nihilistic thugs. As much as they were fighting Red Brigades. I don't. I'm sort of going off on another tangent there. I don't know what you make of that. I don't see Operation Gladio as the good guys versus the bad guys.
Mm-hmm. I could see this other angle where, for example, if a South American country is struggling with a socialist uprising, and the CIA swoops in and says, "Okay, we're going to take care of your socialist problem," then there begins this interdependent relationship that develops between the right-wing government that gets installed and the CIA.
And I think one of the ways you can see that is it's a bit different with your example of South America. I mean, think about somewhere in Eurasia. The CIA, the U.S., is never putting back into power monarchies because they're not interested in actual conservatism. They're not interested in anything actually right-wing. They're interested in Americanism, right? They're interested, and Americanism is, I guess, the way to put this is they're interested in the pluralist economy that keeps America number one. And that is not really ideological, other than they believe in private property. But what does that really mean? They believe in reality? Okay, I mean, in some ways they're better than the Soviets. They're more grounded in reality than the ideology of the Soviet Union. But I don't know that they produce a substantially better outcome. I'm reading Anthony Beever's book and on the Spanish Civil War, and Beaver says that, I think Beaver's a liberal. I think he's a conservative, but insofar as he's a conservative liberal, like big picture liberal, that's what I mean. He's a conservative boomer, but I trust him on numbers, and he says that in Spain, the fascists did kill about 3 times as many as the Republicans. Now, that's I would credit that mostly to the Falange, not to the Carlists. The Carlists were the Catholic monarchists. The Falange were the fascists, and they existed in this sort of imperfect alliance with one another. But I think there's this tendency to fall into fascists at least aren't communist. And I get that, and I have some sympathy for that. But I also I don't think we should fall into I don't think we should fall into false dichotomies. There's a third way, right? It's funny that I'm saying there's a third way, because usually the third way is fascism, whereas my third way is the Shire. The fourth way. The Shire is...
But I think what you're pointing out there is also an example of this tenuous alliance that sometimes appears between Christians and fascists.
Yeah.
And how it seems to work when you're fighting the communists, but then there's this fundamental incompatibility.
What does it do for us? I'm Operation Gladio, right? What is the point of killing innocent civilians, right-wing death squads, killing innocent civilians, but pretending that it was they were communist, so as to justify a Red Scare, because everyone thinks that whatever this assassination was done by communists, when in actuality it was a false flag done by CIA-funded stay-behind operation. I don't know what that really does for us. I don't know. That's not a... Is that a W? So...
Are you winning, son?
Yeah, the temptation is I don't know, smash yourself in the face to own the libs, right? There's some that's the logic behind it. Smash yourself in the face to own the communists. All right, so yeah, Quigley does some counterfactual I've talked about there. I have something in here. Read. There's some good stuff here. Yeah, this is the last stuff, and and then the last page or two here. Okay, here we go. Okay, the growth of the army of specialists foretold by General de Gaulle in 1934. De Gaulle writes a book in 1934, and foreseen by others. Oh, sorry. Let me go back up. This nuclear stalemate, which exists between Russia and America at the time of the writing. This nuclear stalemate, in turn, leads to pervasive consequences in all aspects of the world in the 20th century. It gives rise to a frenzied race between the two superpowers to outstrip each other in the application of science and rationality to life, beginning with weapons. This effort provides such expensive equipment and requires such skill from the operators of this equipment that it makes obsolete the army of temporarily drafted citizen soldiers of the 19th century and of the, quote, armed hordes of World War I and even of World War II, and instead requires the use of highly trained, professional, mercenary fighting men. The growth of the army of specialists foretold by General de Gaulle in 1934 and foreseen by others destroys one of the three basic foundations of political democracy. These three bases are 1. That men are relatively equal in factual power. 2. That men have relatively equal access to the information needed to make a government's decision. And 3. That men have a psychological readiness to accept majority rule in return for those civil rights which will allow any minority to work to build itself up to become a majority. Just as weapons development has destroyed the first of these bases, so secrecy, security considerations, and the growing complexity of the issues have served to undermine the second of these. The third, which was always the weakest of the three, is still in the stage of relative vitality and relative acceptability that it had in the 19th century, but is in much greater danger from the threat of outside forces, notably the changes in the other two bases, plus the greater danger today from external war or from domestic economic breakdown. One great danger in regard to the second of these basic foundations, the availability of information necessary for decision-making, is the impact upon it in the expansion of rationalization. While this has led to automatic and mechanical storage and retrieval of information, it has also led to efforts to establish automatic electronic decision-making on the basis of the growing volume and complexity of such information. This renunciation of the basic feature of being human, judgment and decision-making, is very dangerous, and is a renunciation of the very faculty which gave man his success in the evolutionary struggle with other creatures. If this whole process of human evolution is now to be abandoned in favor of some other unconscious and mechanical method of decision-making, in which the individual's inflexibility and awareness are to be subordinated to a rigid group process, then man must yield to those forms of life, such as the social insects, which have already carried this method to a higher degree of perfection. This whole process has been made the central focus of a recent novel in 1963 called Failsafe by Eugene Burdick and Harvey Wheeler. The reduction of men to automatons in a complicated nexus of expensive machines is well shown in that book. To its picture must be added 2 points. 1, it does not require a blown condenser, as in the book, to unleash the full dangers of the situation. I shouldn't have read this paragraph, but it's a situation which is dangerous in itself, even if it functions perfectly. And 2, the avoidance of the ultimate total catastrophe in the book, because a few men and near the top were able to resume the human functions of decision, self-sacrifice, love of their fellow men, and hope for the future, should not conceal the fact that the whole world in that story came within minutes of handing its resources over to the insects. Regardless, and this is the real. These last 2 paragraphs are very significant. Regardless of the outcome of the situation, it is increasingly clear that, In the 20th century, the expert will replace the industrial tycoon in control of the economic system, even as he will replace the democratic voter in control of the political system. This is because planning will inevitably replace laissez-faire in the relationships between the two systems. This planning may not be single or unified, but it will be planning, in which the main framework and operational forces of the system will be established and limited by the experts on the governmental side. Then the experts within the big units on the economic side will do their planning within these established limitations. Hopefully the elements of choice and freedom may survive for the ordinary individual, in that he may be free to make a choice between two opposing political groups, even if these groups may have little policy choice within the parameters of policy established by the experts, and he may have the choice to switch his economic support from one large unit to the other. But, in general, his freedom and choice will be controlled within very narrow alternatives by the fact that he will be numbered from birth and followed as a number through his educational training, his required military or other public service, his tax contributions, his health and medical requirements, and his final retirement and death benefits. Eventually, in 2 or 3 generations, as the ordinary individual who is not an expert or skilled professional soldier or a prominent industrial executive becomes of less concern to the government, his contacts with the government will become less direct and will take place increasingly through intermediaries. Some movement in this direction may already be seen in those cases where taxpayers whose incomes are entirely from wages or salaries find their whole taxes already paid by their employer, or in decreasing need for the military draftee to be called to serve by a letter from the president. The development of such a situation, a kind of neo-feudalism, in which the relationship of ordinary people to government cease to be direct and are increasingly through intermediaries who are in private rather than public authorities, is, and this is the best part, and the last bit, is a long way in the future. Unfortunately, it's not as far away as I think Quigley thought it would be. But I read that and I was like, oh. And I think that is probably what I've just read out is the point of the book for us.
Okay.
If we stopped here, I'm happy that we that is the bit in the book that needed to be read. If we were not to do any more episodes, Jeff, I'd be unhappy. I want to finish the book, but now that we've gotten that out, that is in many ways that's the sort of the peak of the book of what it tells us.
But hold on, I thought Quigley was supposed to be an apologist for the system.
Well, he says
like that is a pretty damning critique.
In some ways, but he also says in the previous in a chapter or two ago that we're gonna give up like political freedoms for more basic freedoms, although he never says what those are. We talked about this a little bit in the Discord.
Yeah,
I think he's either a realist about it, or he's just sort of like, it is just what it is, or he's like, how do we make the best of this? How do we ride the tiger of technocracy?
Okay.
So there's still a little bit more left, and there's like 2 more pages here. Doesn't really flesh it out, but he talks about how out of this system of nuclear conflict that exists after the Second World War, there's a couple of things come up. Civilians get targeted. There's still this like prevailing belief with like nuclear weapons at the time that like targeting civilian centers is the best way of doing it, because you target a civilian center and the emergency infrastructure has to react to that instead of reacting and fighting back. There's no distinction of war and peace, right? Like, it's just low intensity conflict. And then the other thing that he talks about, which is done a bit more in the next chapter is the weird way in which he talks about the UN, and he talks about he talks about China, and yeah, he talks about China in the next one a bit more, I think. But the sort of the breakdown of like international order and its refocusing into the UN as this like centralized place where there's two types of powers that exist. There's ordinary powers, nuclear power, and superpowers, but as a result of this, out of the result of the sort of trying to garner like clientelism, there's the emergence of a third type of power, which are like fake powers or propped up puppets, which are like these weird tribal players that like should not be nations at all, but are supported in this like shadow game between the two superpowers, and yeah, you
like
get
Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, I don't think that's a bad example. I'm thinking more about like there's just like there's lots of places in Africa that are just like lines on a map, and it's like there's no real country there. That border doesn't mean anything. You know, the government controls the capital city. That's what it means. But yeah, by 1963, single tribes in Africa were looking forward. We're looking toward recognition of statehood through membership in the UN, even when they lacked the financial resources to support a delegation at the UN headquarters in New York City or in the capitals of any major country, and were indeed incapable of controlling police forces to maintain order in their own tribal areas. The last, there's a very short paragraph at the end I highlighted. In this way, the existence of nuclear stalemate within the Cold War carried on the total destruction of traditional international law and the gradual loss of meaning of the established concept of state and public authority, and opened the door to a feudalization of authority somewhat similar to that which the founders of the modern state system and of international law had sought to overcome in the period from the 12th century to the 17th century. That's it. That's my notes. That's the chapter. Oh, did I even go to the last slide? I didn't. This is stuff for the Manhattan Project. So that's the Manhattan Project. And then if there's questions,
I'm gonna channel my inner anarchist here and present kind of the Steelman version of why being enslaved by a system is more liberating than being enslaved by a person.
Mm-hmm.
Because I guess the way to see it is that at least everybody's equally enslaved to the system. Like, at least we don't have to take orders from Orange Man, right? If the system is running every aspect of our lives, then we're not susceptible to the whims of a madman with his finger on the button, quote unquote. And so in that sense, that's why the anarchists say, okay, even if the system has a life of its own in a certain sense and is even more totalitarian than any monarchy could ever dream of being, at least we've erased the hierarchy. We've liberated ourselves from the hierarchy.
The thing I want the anarchist to answer the question about, though, is at the end of the day, does he want the finger on the big red button, or does he want some sort of intelligence, whether that's like real artificial intelligence centralized in a single sort of unitary artificial decision maker, or some sort of decentralized algorithm that's sort of like not a unitary thing, but sort of making some sort of decision from aggregated information, whether he wants whether he wants you, Jeff, with your finger on the button, or whether he wants one of those technological things with their finger on the button.
Well, it's sad to say, but I think most anarchists and technologists would trust the machine more than they would trust a human being.
I'm not sure. I certainly agree with you on the technologist, but I think that the anarchist would say no human should have their finger on the button, but the anarchist presumably believes in Rousseau, and Rousseau's noble savage sort of thing, and that we're dragged low by civilization or these overly complicated structures and technology. And there is this interesting, like, well, what's worse? Is it worse having a single guy who has his finger on the button? It's like he's the guardian of the button, and he has to live with that technology. Or is it better to abdicate entirely to an automated technological system? I think, and I mean, the anarchist inside of me would say, I want the human, because I trust the human more than that algorithm, centralized or decentralized. Anyone in everyone should have a nuke. Everyone should have surface-to-air missiles, but I don't know about a nuke. I mean, the question for the ANCAP, like, would an ANCAP system achieve the scales able to produce a nuclear bomb? Because I take it that, like, the ANCAP system says one of the ideologies of the ANCAP system is that super corporations would not exist. That, like, super corporations are the product of government intervention, sort of changing the rules for them. Okay. And that, like, with variable cost models, like, there are businesses that just get lose their competitive. There's a critical mass at which a business flips from being profitable to unprofitable. And at that point, the government steps in to keep it going. But in an ANCAP system, no government would step in to keep it going, and that a business would not be able to. Presumably, a business would not be big enough to ever be able to produce a nuclear weapon. That's sort of like, were I to put myself in an ANCAP shoe and think about nuclear weapons, that's how I would think about it.
Well, the underlying assumption there, though, is that corporations are only interested in profits.
But
whereas we see.
But but in an ANCAP system, how does a corporation that's not profitable keep going? Like, a corporation can only be not interested in profit when a government is, like, sustaining it, right? When a third party is sustaining it.
Well, there are a lot of corporations that keep going based on stock price alone. Based on speculation alone.
Again, I would guess that the ANCAP would say something like, the type of speculation that we have is unnatural, and that it's inherently, like, facilitated by this unholy alliance of government and business, and that if you took
I mean, you look at a number, like the crypto booms, multiple crypto booms that we've had in its short history, and we see that, you know, speculation that is actually quite natural.
But do you think we would have crypto if we didn't have centralized government authorities to necessitate crypto? I would have thought that crypto would be like, I don't think we'd need crypto in an ANCAP system.
It depends. I think
who would buy
because
Bitcoin?
philosophically, it does line up. Uh, like like the kind of true blue crypto advocates believe that this is the most decentralized, egalitarian system of money that can exist. So
I can certainly.
therefore,
Oh yeah,
the
yeah.
support for it is ideological.
I can certainly see going forward why a future ANCAP system might use Bitcoin. What I'm saying though is that if the system had always been ANCAP, I'm not sure that I
Okay.
think there would have been a necessity to develop crypto. That like people would just sit on
Sure.
gold or silver, like
Yeah.
or something. I'm not sure that they would have come up with um um that might be overly philosophical on my part.
Mm. But it goes back to the genie out of the bottle thing. Like now that
Yeah.
nukes have been developed, now that we've had this totalitarian state arising, there's no turning the clock back to this kind of more primitive point in time when anarcho-capitalism might have worked.
Right. And we will, if we implement anarcho-capitalism, we will not be able to implement anarcho-capitalism that doesn't have our history, right? Like everything we
Yeah.
do has our fixed history. Our history is like at least like the past.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm waiting for Yasuka to argue with me here, but like presumably like the past is fixed and we can't go back. And any system that's implemented will be in reference to the past in some way. So,
Yeah. Shout out to Scott, by the way. I've met up with Scott a couple times actually. Great guy,
we've always had it.
great storyteller.
Oh, yeah. Cool. I appreciate people watching. I think it's more fun. I feel like we're getting a little bit of momentum. Uh, I'm having a lot of fun. This is increasingly the high point of my week. Um,
Mm.
yeah. So
I feel like we really hit on a lot of the topics that's kind of been floating around in our sphere. We kind of tied a lot of that into today's episode.
yeah, I this is one of the bits that, like I say, it really stuck with me. I think there was a chapter a couple of weeks ago about the economic system and the basis of government spending and the military industrial complex. That was a big one. The way the finance system is moved around, that was a big one. But this was a big one. But I think next week is really big. I but I'm not sure if there's any passages that are as significant as the one that I read out. But next week is I made these little stars on the chapters, and I put a star next to chapter 7, next to chapter 14, next to this chapter, chapter 16. But then for chapter 17, I put 3 stars and I highlighted it. So chapter 17 really stuck with me enough that I really highlighted it. And here's the thing, I said Quigley's chapters get longer and longer as the book goes on. We've done 550 pages of an 830 page book, and now the last 280 pages, so more than a quarter of the book. It's about a third of the book, right? It is a third of the book. A third of the book is the last 4
Yep.
chapters. So, in terms of pages, we've only done 2/3. In terms of chapters, we've done 16 of 20, 4/5. So there's a little there's a lot in here, and I might break the chapters up depending upon how things go. But
Cool.
but a lot of it is him speculating about the future, and he's wrong about what happens.
Okay.
So that's a bit more the last chapter though. Anyway. Yes. Yep. The Quigley's Treasure and Hope's quite the book. It's my copy is 830 pages, but that's like PDF, like printed book. The original book was like 1,400 pages, so it's quite something. Ugh. That's we've been going for a while. Next week looks a bit more at that nuclear rivalry. Looks at China, and I think like the emergence of the communists, and the American establishment. So the Anglo-American establishment, which probably won't be next week. That's in the chapter. For next week, but when we get to the Anglo-American establishment, I am going to do an episode on that in between. If that is chapter 17, I'm not going to try and do all that together, and I'm just going to talk about the book, The Anglo-American Establishment, because Quigley doesn't deal with the stuff that he writes about in the Anglo-American establishment. He instead writes the last like 20-30 years in Tragedy and Hope, and it plugs in or sits on top of what he does in the Anglo-American establishment, which ends in about the 30s, maybe like the end of the Second World War. So there's sort of like, in some ways, the bit of this next chapter is kind of a sequel to, or like an update on the Anglo-American establishment. So yeah.
Right.
Cool.
And what if I could give one bit of feedback? More visuals,
Even
more
more
images.
I thought about that. I wasn't sure if the other thing is I forgot was that I'm doing it this way with a window. I'm not doing a slideshow. I just have the window zoomed in on my slide, and I couldn't figure out how to do each picture coming up individually. So every time I changed the slide, it was all the pictures together. But yeah, okay, more pictures next time.
Renegade says pictures and words.
And words. Ugh. I spoiled you with the Second World War because there's so many pictures of the Second World War. Some of these things are going to be hard to find pictures of. So, all right, more pictures.
Scott says words. Use the AI.
Use the AI to generate.
Use the AI to make more images.
It takes a while to generate.
It's pretty hit and miss.
It takes a minute or two for to generate pictures from.
Okay.
So like sitting there and then waiting.
I use a site called Night Cafe. It's pretty fast.
Okay.
But I can't quite get the same images that you get. So.
What do you mean?
It seems to be better at generating.
Yeah. Maybe I'll see what I can get it to. What prompts I can get it to. I think one of the things that helps is asking for a particular like style.
Mm-hmm.
So asking it to like produce a stylized, like those 1940s, 50s comic book style, I quite like.
Yeah.
Although I feel bad for you, Jeff, because the AI likes to. The AI thinks that hobbits are taller than Asian guys in many pictures, which I'm offended on your behalf. That I'm the.
Well, in this case, it does reflect real life.
Yeah.
You're like
Giant
6'5"
hobbit.
or something. Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. Well, I'm having I always enjoy these, and I hope you guys are enjoying them too. And we're nearly through Tragedy and Hope. We're nearly through Quigley, but I appreciate your patience, and I hope you guys are enjoying it too. And yeah, let's see if I can get the music up.
Are men trash?
Ooh, that's not what I wanted. Okay, here we go. This isn't what I wanted. This is that sorry. This is bad TV. I'm just gonna play. I haven't listened to all of this. This is what I'll play. Thanks, guys, and see you next week. Or next episode. Hopefully next week.